I shouldn't have dug where the earth was silent. This is the true account of the terrifying conflict I faced at the Macabre farm in Nebraska. The year was 1942, the air thick with dust and the suffocating smell of dead cattle. My name is Calvin Rexford. I arrived at the desolate property to investigate strange anomalies reported by the local sheriff. The oppressive heat pressed down, making the dry grass crunch like old bones under my boots. The farmhouse was a skeletal ruin, but the silence around the rusted well was aggressive, and the stench was metallic. I knelt, pushing aside the straw, and saw the impossible, a perfect series of bare human footprints. They did not lead away. They were sharply defined, deepening straight into the ground, as if the soil was consuming them alive. If you like horror stories, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. The sun, a blinding orange disk in the dusty Nebraska sky of 1942, offered no warmth, only a suffocating heat that seemed to press the very air out of my lungs. I remained kneeling beside the rusted well, my eyes locked on the impossible anomaly. These weren't impressions left in soft mud. This was baked, hard-packed clay, the kind that cracks and splinters under pressure. Yet the bare human footprints were sunk deep, the heels already buried past visibility, the defined lines of the toes cutting sharply downward, as if the soil possessed the consistency of thick, cooling tar. My training as an investigator demanded logic, but logic was failing rapidly. Erosion was absent. Scuff marks, signs of a frantic, dragging struggle, were completely missing. Whoever had stood here had simply yielded, being inexorably pulled down, upright, without resistance. It was a terrifying, deliberate descent. I ran my gloved hand over the edge of the deepest print. The dirt was strangely cool, almost damp, despite the surrounding desiccation. That metallic stench, like old copper pennies left out in the rain, was stronger here, radiating up from the depths of the hole. It was the smell of blood, heavy and oxidized, yet mixed with something else, a pungent, earthy musk that felt ancient and wrong. I retrieved the small, entrenching shovel from my kit, the handle sticky with the sweat pooling in my palm. I had to know what was below. Perhaps a shallow grave had collapsed, or a unique geological sinkhole was at work. But the meticulous, isolated nature of the prints argued against natural chaos. It implied a victim, or worse, a system of consumption. I pushed the shovel blade into the earth just beside the smallest, freshest print. The ground resisted, then gave way with a sickening, wet slurp, not the dry crunch I expected. As I began to excavate, throwing aside clods of soil that crumbled too easily, the oppressive silence of the Macabre farm began to fracture. It wasn't a sound made by wind or bird, but a faint, rhythmic thudding coming from the dilapidated barn 50 yards away. It was dull, persistent, like a heavy pendulum swinging through thick cotton, only stopping to start again after a measured pause. The sound wasn't overtly threatening, but in that deafening quiet, it felt like the heartbeat of the desolate property, slow, monstrous, and very much alive. Ignoring the primal scream urging me to flee this desolate patch of Nebraska, I pocketed my shovel and started toward the barn, my boots crunching over the dying grass. The air grew thicker with every step, saturated not just with dust and metallic tang, but now with a sweet, cloying odor, the unbearable perfume of rendering fat and spoiled meat. It caught in the back of my throat, forcing me to breathe through the sleeve covering my mouth. The barn doors, warped and hanging precariously from single rusted hinges, stood slightly ajar, creating a black maw. Inside, the light was sickly gray, cut by shafts of dust-filled sunlight. The thudding stopped entirely the moment I pushed the door open just wide enough to slip through. The interior was a charnel house wrapped in shadow. Old farming equipment, a rusting hay rake, a cracked saddle, lay strewn across the dirt floor. But the floor itself was stained deep, perpetually dark, with something thick and viscous that defied cleaning. Then I saw it. In the center of the vast, echoing space, where a few mangled feed sacks lay piled, the dirt floor wasn't merely stained, it was disturbed. It was sculpted. Circular patterns, perfectly concentric, had been pressed into the ground, radiating outward from a central point. They were too large to be human, too symmetrical to be accidental, and the sickeningly sweet smell here was almost volcanic. I raised my lantern, illuminating the area just above the feed sacks, and my blood turned instantly to ice. Hanging from a ceiling beam, tangled in rusted barbed wire, was a single immense object, dripping a slow, yellow-green substance onto the sculpted earth below. It was a mass of stretched, pallid hide, peeled away from muscle and bone, unrecognizable yet horribly familiar, its surface still twitching faintly with minute, spasmodic movements. My breath hitched, and I took a desperate step back toward the door, my heels sinking instantly into the floor. The sculpted earth around the central stain was not packed soil. It was a crust, a thin, brittle shell of dried matter that crumbled beneath my weight. A sudden, deep pressure clamped around my ankle, and I realized I wasn't just standing on the ground anymore. The ground was pulling me in, just as it had pulled the owners of those initial human footprints. The crushing pressure around my foot intensified, followed by a low, scraping sound from directly beneath the crumbling dirt, like vast, unseen teeth chewing on rock. If you were in Calvin's position, what specific fear, the fear of being pulled down, or the fear of what was doing the pulling, would paralyze you first? Let me know in the comments below. The crushing pressure around my foot intensified, followed by a low, scraping sound from directly beneath the crumbling dirt, like vast, unseen teeth chewing on rock. The terror wasn't just physical, the immediate threat of being dragged into the cold, fetid earth. It was the stark, horrifying realization that the ground itself was predatory. I thrashed wildly, my investigative neutrality shattered, replaced by the instinctual panic of a trapped animal. I planted my left heel against the precarious crust, shoving backward, my gloved fingers scrabbling against the stained, splintered wood of the barn door frame. The air pressure around my chest seemed to mount, forcing the sickeningly sweet, rancid perfume of rendering fat deeper into my lungs, making me gag. "No! Get off me!" The sound was pathetic, thin, utterly useless against the monstrous mechanism working below. The dirt gripping my right ankle wasn't merely sticky, it was adhesive, dense, and unnaturally cold. It felt less like earth and more like muscle contracting around bone. The scraping sound below crescendoed into a wet, grating shuck, 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 and the pressure intensified, pulling my knee down hard against the floor. I felt the brittle shell of the sculpted earth give way completely under my weight. I fought the vertigo, the dizzying certainty that I was about to join the owners of those impossible human footprints outside. I wrenched my gaze upward, locating the single, sickening beacon of horror, the stretched, pallid hide hanging from the beam, slowly dripping its yellow-green residue. That substance was the source of the cloying sweetness, the horrific preservative agent that defined this macabre farm. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I kicked out with my free leg, aiming blindly at the floor around my trapped ankle. The crust shattered further, and the sickly cold air that rushed up from the gap was thick with the copper-penny metallic smell. I could hear movement now, not just the scraping, but a liquid churning, slow and continuous, like a gigantic stomach rolling over its contents. My fingers found the cold, greasy handle of the rusting hay rake lying near the wall. I pulled, dragging the heavy, unwieldy tool over the ground, the tines catching on the grime. It offered a moment of leverage. I shoved the handle hard into the earth just above my trapped ankle, using it as a fulcrum, and pulled upward with every muscle I possessed. There was a repulsive tearing sound, followed by a sudden, sickening release. I tumbled backward onto the dirt floor, sliding several feet until my back slammed into the warped wood of the barn wall. My right ankle was free, but slicked with the black, thick material that coated the floor, a substance that smelled overwhelmingly of sulfur and decay. Panting, clutching the hay rake like a makeshift weapon, I aimed the beam of my lantern back at the hole where my foot had been. The concentric patterns I had noted earlier were now fully ruptured. The sculpted earth had peeled back, revealing a dark cavity perhaps 3 feet in diameter. It wasn't a sinkhole. It was a throat or a vent, perfectly circular and lined with something that glistened wetly in the sickly grey light. The light illuminated the edges of the orifice. They weren't rough or ragged like broken earth, but impossibly smooth, rimmed with a dense, fibrous material that looked disturbingly like heavily calloused skin. And from that dark, slick lining extending into the hole were dozens of small, twitching filaments, not roots, but pale, thin tendrils, retracting quickly now that the prey had escaped. These were the things that had seized my ankle, mimicking the tenacity of cooling tar. I understood then the nature of the system of consumption. This wasn't merely a geological anomaly or a disturbed burial site. The ground itself was organic, engineered, or colonized. The whole barn, perhaps the whole farm, was merely a massive, shallow digestive tract, a feeder mechanism for whatever vast, unseen creature or process lay just beneath the Nebraska topsoil, the continuous, low thudding. I had heard earlier, the heartbeat of the desolate property was not a pendulum, but the slow, rhythmic opening and closing of this vast, subterranean maw. The stench from the hole was now unbearable, a concentrated dose of decay and ancient copper. I scrambled backward, keeping the hay rake pointed toward the black cavity, my eyes scanning the surrounding dirt. The concentric patterns were already beginning to shift. The fractured crust slowly, imperceptibly, creeping inward, knitting itself back into its circular, symmetrical form. It was preparing to seal the wound and wait for the next offering. I had to get out, but my gaze caught the far wall. Partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting burlap was a stack of handwritten journals, bound with twine, their covers warped and brittle with age. They must have belonged to the previous owners, the missing family whose prints led into the ground. If I was to survive this night, I needed to understand the rules of this gruesome ecosystem. I lunged for the journals, scooping up the entire sticky pile. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, not from the hole at my feet, but seemingly encompassing the entire floor. A deep, resonating shudder that vibrated through the very handle of the hay rake. I glanced back at the hole just as the black fibers on its rim retracted fully, pulling the entire mouth of the orifice inward like a sphincter contracting. The crust of the floor around the central stain buckled dramatically, and a plume of sickeningly sweet vapor burst upward as the floor beneath me gave way with a decisive, catastrophic crack, dropping me shoulder deep into the cold, churning darkness. Tell me, from which city and state or country are you watching this story unfold? The drop was not far, but the impact was worse than any fall onto solid earth. I plunged into a cold, viscous slurry, a medium that resisted and clung, immediately coating me from the shoulders down in the dense, sulphurous muck. I had anticipated a pit, perhaps a chamber, but this was a stomach, deep and pulsating. My lungs convulsed against the stench, which was now overwhelmingly metallic, a boiling pot of old pennies and rotten meat, so thick it felt like I was breathing fluid. The liquid churning was deafening here, a heavy, rhythmic sloshing that resonated deep in my bones, confirming the nature of the subterranean entity. It was digesting, continually rolling over its contents just beneath the Nebraska farmland. I held the stack of journals tight against my chest, with my left arm, desperately trying to keep them above the black, moving substance. The hay rake, still clutched in my right hand, scraped uselessly against the slick, yielding wall of the shaft, which was impossibly tight around my torso. The walls were yielding but firm, lined with that disturbing calloused skin I had seen on the rim of the orifice. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. This substance, unlike cooling tar, was alive, actively trying to adhere to me. It felt less like being trapped and more like being hugged by something immensely strong and incredibly cold. The pressure increased immediately. The orifice above, which had admitted me, was contracting, squeezing the dense material around my hips and chest, threatening to pull me down into the true depths where the light of my lantern, which had mercifully swung and hooked onto a high splinter in the barn wall, could not reach. I kicked out trying to find footing, but found only the yielding viscosity of the fluid. My boots were instantly sucked deeper, the pull insistent and powerful, like being caught in a dense subterranean current. I needed leverage, and I needed it immediately, before the pressure crushed my ribs or the darkness claimed the journals. With a desperate cry that tasted of iron and sulfur, I braced the head of the heavy hayrake against the fibrous lining just above my shoulder. The material groaned, sticky strands stretching and snapping as I applied my weight. The rake began to sink, but it bought me 2 crucial seconds. I pulled upward with a surge of terror-fueled strength, my muscles screaming in protest, dragging my body through the tightening passage. The tearing sound that followed was not the wood breaking, but the thick black muck relinquishing its grip on my lower body, snapping away with the sound of suction and wet cloth. I burst free of the suffocating hole, tumbling onto the fractured barn floor, scrambling backward until my head hit the rough planking again. I lay there gasping, slicked from head to waist in the foul, cold material, my heart slamming against my ribs like a frantic animal. The hole was already closing. The segmented earth around the ruptured perimeter was shifting visibly, the cracks sealing, the rim of pale fibers drawing back into the darkness. In moments, the surface would be pristine again, except for the large, wet stain of my exit. I didn't look back down. I focused on the one thing I still held, the journals. They were sticky and smeared with the black residue, but intact. This macabre farm, engineered for consumption, had already claimed the missing family. Their gruesome fate was etched in the human footprints that led into the ground, and now I held their final testimony. My hands trembled as I tore the twine binding off the top journal. The handwriting inside was shaky, fading ink on brittle yellowed paper. It was dated 1941, nearly a year before my arrival. The pen strokes grew manic, crossing out words and scratching frantic corrections. August 14th. It feeds slowly, but it is never full. Martha says the dirt is moving, dreaming. The crop withered, and the soil smells sweet now, like sick honey. It took the chickens first, then the mule. The prints led nowhere, just down. We realized too late the soil is not soil, it's a skin. I swallowed the metallic taste in my throat and flipped the page rapidly, finding the final entry, scribbled just before their probable consumption. The script was almost illegible, a final, desperate warning. The heart. I can hear the heart. It's not below, not entirely. The pumping is too high, too close to the surface. It's using the barn. It's using the skin we stretched, the hide, to keep the air cold, to preserve the offerings. It wants them slow. But the bloodline, the deep root, the root isn't feeding, it's... The sentence ended abruptly, severed mid-word by a jagged vertical rip in the paper, as if the writer had been seized violently in the middle of his final warning. I dropped the hayrake. My eyes were fixed on the words, then they snapped up to the horrifying pallid hide that still hung above me, dripping its sweet yellow-green residue. That substance was the preservative. That hide was the surface filter. But then my blood ran cold, freezing the sulphurous sweat on my skin. The final terrifying line, though incomplete, hinted at a deeper purpose, a vertical connection. I glanced back at the closing orifice at my feet, and then up at the dripping hide, and then my gaze locked onto the main support beam directly above me, the beam to which the dripping hide was affixed. The wood of the beam, where the hide's tethers were knotted, was weeping, not with the yellow-green preservative, but with something thicker, blacker, and infinitely slower. And stretching from that central beam, radiating outward across the ceiling rafters of the barn, were thin, cable-like veins, pulsing with a deep, sickening grey color. The creature below wasn't just consuming the offerings, it was drawing the vital elements upward, incorporating the structure of the barn into its own anatomy. I realized then that I wasn't trapped inside a mere feeding ground. I was trapped inside the creature's central nervous system, and I could hear, now localized and horribly loud directly above me, the slow, thick, rhythmic thudding of the pulse. The whole roof was its heart. And then the beam groaned, a sound not of warped wood, but of immense concentrated mass shifting, and a thick drop of that black substance from the ceiling fell squarely onto the exposed paper of the journal in my hands, sizzling faintly as it scorched the last visible words. I looked up, ready to run, but the entire ceiling, the entire inverted heart, was already beginning to bow inward, slowly lowering, visibly contracting with the next powerful resonating beat. The drop of black corrosive ichor hissed, dissolving the journal's final words into a smear of acidic pulp. I didn't need to read any further. The message was clear. Exit now, or be incorporated. The rhythmic thudding above accelerated, vibrating through the fractured floorboards and rattling my teeth. I scrambled backward, clutching the ruined journals to my chest, my body screaming from the sulphurous muck that chilled me to the bone. The barn was no longer architecture. It was a pressurized, contracting organ, a colossal diaphragm squeezing its contents. The ceiling, already concave, bowed lower with sickening speed, pulling the central support beam with it. The black sap, the creature's venous blood, began to weep profusely from the radiating grey lines, raining down in heavy, scalding drops that pocked the floor where they struck. I stumbled over the hay rake, abandoning the journals for the immediate necessity of movement. My only escape route was the large, rotting double doors opposite the hayloft entrance. They were barred from the inside, a desperate and futile measure the former occupants, the missing family, had taken. I threw my weight against the splintered wood, my shoulder hitting the door with a dull, wet impact that sent shockwaves through the entire structure. The wood groaned, but held fast. "Move!" I screamed, the sound swallowed immediately by the monstrous, amplified pulse of the heart overhead. The air pressure was changing rapidly. The sickly sweet aroma of the preserved hide, mixed with the sharp tang of iron and the stink of subterranean decay, became thick and difficult to inhale, pressing against my lungs. I kicked wildly at the base of the doors, trying to dislodge the heavy internal bar, but the structure was too deeply integrated, laced with those fibrous, pale roots mentioned in the journal, the creature's structural tissue. The contraction intensified. The beam above my head was now only 6 feet from the floor, dripping its black secretion onto the exact spot where I had moments earlier been lying. I could hear the fibers of the hide straining, tearing loose from the rafters with sounds like wet linen ripping, just before they were absorbed back into the pulsing grey veins. This wasn't merely a collapse, it was a deliberate compression designed to render the contents palatable. Desperate, I scanned the chaotic floor for leverage, my eyes catching on a heavy length of dry timber, thick and sturdy, a remnant of a former stall. I snatched it up, its dryness a relief against my sticky, cold hands, and rammed the end of it repeatedly against the rusty, corroded crossbar of the doors. Thud, the heartbeat shaking my aim. Thud, another drop sizzled near my foot. Thud, on the 4th furious strike, the bar snapped with a ringing metallic shriek. I pulled back instantly, terrified that the vibration would trigger a more violent reaction, but the mechanism of the heart was slow, biological, and utterly relentless. The ceiling continued its downward creep. I threw my shoulder against the doors one last time, ignoring the searing pain. The rotting wood protested, then gave way with a splintering cry. The doors burst outward, revealing the pale, dusty light of the Nebraska evening, a vision of freedom. I didn't pause to appreciate the open air. I launched myself through the gap, tumbling onto the dry, cracked earth of the farmyard. I rolled twice, instinctively shielding my eyes from the sudden glare, and then scrambled upright, turning back immediately to witness the monstrous interior of the barn. In the brief moment the doors stayed open, the truth of the creature's anatomy became terrifyingly clear. The entire internal volume was dark and wet, compressed by the descending roof. I could see the thick grey veins stretching like taut cables across the remaining rafters, shimmering faintly as they conducted the black vital fluid. The barn was the atrium of a massive, buried body. But as I stood there, gasping the relatively clean, though dust-choked air, I noticed something horrifying on the dusty ground right at the threshold of the doors. Where I had just burst through, the soil was not ordinary dirt. It was mottled, yellowish, and incredibly fibrous, the same yielding material that lined the orifice I had escaped. And embedded in this material, just at the edge of the open doorway, were the undeniable residual signs of the missing family. Not just the human footprints leading into the ground, but a child's small cloth doll, half submerged and stiffened by the yellowish substance, a leather strap from a work boot, and a thick coil of Martha's long auburn hair, seemingly rooted and extending downward into the ground. They hadn't just been consumed below, their bodies had been pressed, filtered, and their remnants integrated into the very skin of the Macabre farm's surface layer, right up to the doorframe. I wrenched my gaze away, the nausea overwhelming me. I had to run. I had to get away from the immediate perimeter. I turned and started running across the yard towards the dry, distant fields, but I had only taken 3 steps when the rhythmic, thudding pulse which had been deafening inside the barn shifted completely. It wasn't inside anymore. The next pulse, vast, deep, and heavier than anything I had felt before, didn't vibrate the barn. It vibrated the entire earth beneath my feet. The ground shuddered, and the sound was no longer isolated. It was ambient, radiating out from the barn in concentric waves. Boom! I skidded to a stop, digging my boots into the soil. I looked back at the barn, which was now swaying slightly on its foundation, and then across the endless, flat expanse of the Nebraska prairie. The pulse came again, and this time it wasn't just the ground that shook. Far across the desolate fields, nearly a quarter-mile away, I saw the shimmering. The shockwave of the beat was traveling outward, distorting the air and dust. And then, beyond the shimmer, rising from the dry field where only unbroken soil and withered wheat should have been, I saw the structure respond. The creature was too massive to be contained by the simple farmyard. Responding to the internal pressure, a shape began to rise slowly, painfully, out of the earth 100 yards away. It was long, dark, and perfectly vertical, like a stake driven up from the earth's crust. It was too tall to be a fence post, and it was moving with a slow, agonizing rotation. I squinted against the fading light, trying to comprehend the geometry of the rising object, before the next thunderous boom caused the entire landscape to momentarily blur, and in that fraction of a second, I recognized the structure, horrifyingly complete, impossibly massive, and dripping wet with deep subterranean mud. It was the farmhouse itself, the missing family's home, which had been perfectly sunk and absorbed, and was now being slowly extruded from the ground, rotated a quarter turn, and angled directly at me, like a colossal mud-caked cannon barrel aimed for firing. The sight of the farmhouse, the family's home, now an instrument of deep subterranean malice, snapped the paralysis from my limbs. I spun, tearing across the dry soil, aiming for the relative shelter of the fence line far to my left. The earth itself was too close, too hot, too much a part of the pulsing anatomy I was fleeing, so I ran low, churning up clouds of fine, sulfur-tinged dust. The massive rhythmic boom became my metronome. It wasn't the sound of an isolated mechanism. It was the slow, titanic compression of the surrounding land. Each beat was a measure of the creature's effort, forcing that dark structure upward. I risked a glance back. The farmhouse was now fully exposed, coated in a thick, oozing layer of black muck that clung to the clapboard siding and streamed down the darkened windows like frozen tears. It stood impossibly tall, tilted at a cruel, deliberate angle, the entire front porch now facing me, gaping like a mouth filled with mud and splintered wood. It was no longer a symbol of domesticity. It was a biological weapon, primed on the vast, flat expanse of the Nebraska farm. The rotation accelerated slightly, settling the structure onto its new, unseen axis. The sound was a horrific blend of stone grinding on stone and the wet snap of old lumber fibers tearing away from buried foundation posts. It was the sound of geology being rearranged by hunger. And then the thudding changed. The boom did not repeat. Instead, a long, continuous, escalating whirr began to rise from the barn behind me, a sound of massive hydraulic pressure building, the low frequency of the heart giving way to the high whine of expenditure. The entire atmosphere seemed to tighten. I knew that sound. It was the pressure building within the colossal grey veins I had witnessed inside the barn. The creature was charging its weapon with its own hideous black vital fluid. I pushed my legs harder, my boots pounding into the dry, fibrous surface. Every step confirmed the terrifying reality I had seen at the doorway. The soil of this macabre farm was processed organic matter. The ground yielded slightly with a spongy give that was entirely unnatural. It was saturated earth, filled not with moisture, but with the filtered, residual remains of everything absorbed. I could almost feel the phantom human footprints beneath my racing soles, the millions of microscopic remnants woven into the crust. The whirr reached a screaming crescendo, deafening and agonizing, pressing in on my eardrums. I was 20 yards from the fence line, diving into a ditch filled with sun-baked weeds and thistles, when the farmhouse fired. It wasn't a projectile of wood or stone. It was a pressurized jet of concentrated black material, the same viscous, oily fluid that circulated within the barn's walls. The jet erupted from the front doorway of the house, the muzzle, with a sound like wet cordite exploding. The fluid streaked past, a thick, boiling column that moved faster than any cannonball, and it completely missed me. For a split second, I thought I was safe. Then I watched where the blast impacted. 50 yards beyond me, the jet struck a thick, rusted tractor, sitting abandoned since the Macabre farm had begun its ingestion process. The instant the black fluid touched the metal, the tractor didn't just sizzle, it dissolved. It didn't rust or decay. The entire structure, steel, rubber, and paint, was instantly liquefied, consumed by the powerful biological solvent. In less than 3 seconds, where the tractor had stood, there was only a steaming depression in the ground and a small pool of the deep, black residual liquid sinking slowly into the fibrous soil. My breath hitched in my throat, choked by the dust and the sheer impossible horror of the sight. The creature wasn't just collapsing structures, it was dissolving matter at the molecular level, integrating it immediately into its body mass. I realized then that the farmhouse cannon had not missed me by accident. It had deliberately aimed at the tractor, not as a target practice, but as a calibration. The organism had measured the density and volume of the target, assessed the required energy, and performed a test strike right in front of the escaping prey. And now, slowly, sickeningly, the house cannon began to adjust its angle. The grinding noise returned, softer this time, more precise. I could see the dark, porous wood of the farmhouse foundation pivot a fraction of a degree, tracking my position with agonizing slowness. I was still pinned in the ditch, trying to claw myself deeper into the dry, sharp weeds. The pulse returned, softer at first, a preparatory beat. Thump, thump. Then, in the center of the farmhouse's gaping doorway where the blast had issued, I saw movement. The black fluid was receding, being drawn back into the depths of the structure. But replacing it, slowly beginning to accumulate at the threshold, was something else entirely. It was denser, heavier, and shone with an awful, slick whiteness in the fading Nebraska light. It coalesced into an amorphous mass, and as the pressure began to build once more, the whoa-ah, starting its long, relentless climb, I recognized the material. It was bone, densely packed and ground down, compressed by the biological forces of the monster, and embedded within the bone paste, like macabre shrapnel, I could clearly make out two pale, perfectly formed teeth, child-sized, and the fragmented, recognizable shape of a wedding band. The creature wasn't aiming to dissolve me with fluid anymore. It was preparing to fire the compressed, agonizing remains of the missing family, loaded and waiting to be fired directly at my body. I had only seconds, and the gun was aimed true. I scrambled out of the ditch, praying I could find cover before the farm decided to turn its gruesome ammunition into my final resting place. I burst from the ditch, scraping my forearms raw on the brittle stalks of thistle. The sound was a physical hammer blow against my temples, that accelerating, agonizing whoosh had climaxed into a sustained, high-pitched scream, indicating terminal pressure. My brain didn't process the horror of the macabre shrapnel, only the primal, desperate need for trajectory avoidance. Get out of the line of fire. I sprinted low to the ground, trying to utilize the narrow shadow cast by the rusting wire fence that demarcated the property line of the macabre farm. The air around the fence vibrated violently, distorting the dry afternoon heat haze. The sound wasn't just auditory, it was kinetic. I felt it rattling the calcium in my own skeleton, a sensation that bordered on nausea. My boots struck the processed soil, that ghastly fibrous loam that constituted the feeding ground of the entity. Every jarring step reminded me of the unseen mass beneath, the layers upon layers of digested life. I could practically feel the phantom pressure of the millions of microscopic human footprints that had preceded me, all absorbed, all integrated, all leading tragically into the ground. The texture was like running across a damp, compacted sponge, smelling faintly of rendered fat and ozone, the byproduct of the massive energy conversion taking place inside the house cannon. I threw myself sideways just as the farmhouse cannon released its gruesome payload. The scream of the whirr snapped instantly, replaced by a devastating, dry crack-pish. The sound was less fluid expulsion and more like a high-velocity shotgun firing lead shot mixed with concrete dust. A thick, sickening spray of white and grey material, the pulverized, agonizing remains of the missing family, lanced through the space where I had been a millisecond before. I hit the ground hard, my face pressed into the fibrous, sickening earth, a cloud of foul-smelling dust engulfing me. The brief proximity to the blast carried with it a terrifying coppery scent, the smell of freshly broken blood, rendered dry and metallic by extreme heat and pressure. I risked a glance backward. The shrapnel had struck the rusty barbed wire fence exactly where my body had been running. It didn't just break the wire. The projectile of dense, compressed bone had vaporized the steel, shearing off the cedar posts right at the base. But worse was the ground impact. A yard-wide steaming crater had opened up, revealing the deep, disturbed soil. Lying scattered and embedded into the crater's raw edges were the fragments. They weren't dust. They were chunks of dense white material, bone, sharpened and pressurized, driven into the earth with the force of an artillery shell. I saw a recognizable piece of curved skull fragment glittering with microscopic wetness, and just beside it, half buried in the fresh disturbance of the Macabre farm soil, was the crushed, unmistakable gold of the wedding band. I scrambled further, the sheer destructive power of the bone ammunition reinforcing the utter hopelessness of my situation on this desolate Nebraska plain. Running straight was suicide. The creature was accurate, methodical, and infinitely patient. I needed substantial shelter. 50 yards ahead, past the ruined fence line, was the only remaining feature on this terrifying landscape. The old smokehouse, a squat, solid structure made of thick fieldstone, designed to withstand prairie storms and perhaps, if I was lucky, a second blast of this biological shrapnel. I sprinted toward the stone building, my chest burning, the image of the wedding band, the final, intimate proof of the organism's complete ingestion, seared into my vision. The profound silence that followed the blast was worse than the noise. It was the silence of calculation. I reached the relative shelter of the smokehouse wall, pushing my aching body against the rough stone, my desperate hands fumbling across the mossy surface. I looked back one last time at the monolithic farmhouse. It wasn't pivoting on its foundation anymore. Instead, the entire structure was slowly, deliberately sinking, melting itself lower into the earth, stabilizing its base for an even more massive shot. It was preparing to fire again, and this time it was going to hit whatever it was aimed at. And as I scanned the smokehouse wall for a window or door, praying for entry, my fingers brushed against something horrifying protruding from the mossy grout between the stones, right at eye level. It was a lock of dark human hair, pressed flat and sealed into the mortar, perfectly preserved by the stone. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, choking the stale air in my lungs. I wasn't hiding behind the structure. The stones weren't merely construction material, they were compressed, calcified components of the creature's previous harvest, gathered and consolidated over decades on this gruesome Nebraska property. And they were humming. I could feel the low, sickening thump-to-thump of the pressure pulse, the creature's hideous internal beat, now resonating directly through the wall against my back. This confirmed the horrifying truth. The smokehouse was not cover at all, but merely the next appendage in the vast organic system of this entity. The thick stone wall began to warm beneath my frantic hands. I had run straight from the cannon's muzzle and taken refuge directly against its monstrous heart, and now the wall itself was beginning to yield, softening, slowly embracing me into its horrifying composition. The warmth was immediate, unnatural, and profoundly sickening. It wasn't the dull heat of sun-baked stone. It was the biological furnace of an active digestive system. The rough fieldstone, which moments ago offered the false security of granite, was softening under my desperate palms. The mossy grout wasn't merely damp, it was viscoelastic, yielding with an oily stickiness. I could feel the microscopic structures of the stones shifting, rearranging themselves, preparing for amalgamation. The trapped lock of dark hair, already sealed for decades, seemed to twitch in the mortar, absorbing the resonant thump, thump that pulsed through the horrifying edifice. I tore myself away from the wall, the sound of my skin peeling from the softening surface, a dull, wet suction that sounded impossibly loud in the prairie silence. The residual scent on my hands was worse than the dust I had inhaled, a thick, sweet smell, like rendered marrow mixed with old lime. I had sought refuge against a wall that was actively trying to eat me. I stumbled out onto the open, pulverized ground, the fibrous soil yielding beneath my boots like a mattress filled with desiccated straw. My eyes were locked on the farmhouse cannon 50 yards away. The whole monstrous bulk was now resting lower, its primary feeder conduits, thick vein-like structures running along the foundation, glowing faintly with internal orange light. The previous shot had been calculated. This one felt like desperation, a colossal sweeping clearance shot designed to wipe clean the entire area between the fence and the smokehouse. The ominous humming returned, higher and sharper than before, escalating from a low vibration to an unbearable high-frequency whine that drilled into the roots of my teeth. It was the sound of ultimate compression, of matter being pulverized past the point of molecular recognition. I had maybe 3 seconds. I threw myself flat, belly down into the compacted, nutrient-rich earth of the Macabre farm. There was nowhere to go, no indentations, no features, just the ghastly expanse of digested life that made up this property. I pressed my face hard into the soil, biting back a scream as the air pressure around me dropped violently. Vzzzzt, crack, whoom! The second blast wasn't a focused projectile. It was a horizontal scatter shot, a wide-angle sweep of pressurized bone dust and shrapnel aimed directly at my prone form. The noise was blinding, a tearing sound that ripped the quiet 1942 Nebraska atmosphere apart. A wave of superheated wind, carrying the sickening fine spray of biological ammunition, roared over my head. I felt the blast peel the collar of my jacket up and the momentary agonizing burn on the back of my neck where the bone dust particulate kissed my skin. The sheer mass of the shot was devastating. Where I had been running moments earlier, the very ground exploded. The shrapnel, traveling at supersonic speeds, didn't just hit the dirt, it vaporized it, stripping away the upper 3 feet of soil in a searing trench that ran for 20 yards. The wind, sheer alone, threatened to roll me into the kill zone. I waited rigid and breathless until the agonizing roar subsided into an echoing vacuum of silence, broken only by the rhythmic, deep thump, thump of the hidden heart of the system, now emanating from the ground itself. My ears rang violently. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, trying to gauge the damage. The trench beside me was still smoking, the edges slicked and fused by the immense heat. But the most horrifying revelation was beneath me, in the soil that hadn't been pulverized. The entity's feeding habits were not merely messy, they were meticulous. As I lay there, trying to find the strength to move, I noticed the texture of the soil right under my gaze. It wasn't just organic loam, it was a dense, interlocking carpet. The top layer of earth on this Macabre farm was not dirt at all, but a crust composed entirely of the fused, processed remnants of every creature absorbed here. And set into this sickening matrix were the molds. I looked closer, swallowing a wave of vomit that tasted like copper and fear. Embedded in the fibrous topsoil, preserved in ghastly detail, were the exact calcified casts of the last steps of the missing. I saw the perfect, hardened impression of a man's work boot heel, then a woman's narrower shoe, and then, horrifically, the diminutive, precise outline of a child's canvas sneaker tread. These weren't fleeting impressions made in mud. These were permanent, skeletal molds, the human footprints of the consumed leading irreversibly into the ground, preserved as a grim testament to the entity's complete ingestion process. My hand was resting just inches from the small, perfectly preserved cast of the child's shoe print. It was horrifyingly tangible, the calcified texture coarse and dry. But as I stared, focusing on the tiny, molded ridges of the sneaker sole, I saw a subtle movement. The shoe print, the hardened impression of bone and minerals, was not inert. A micro-thin film of clear, viscous moisture began to seep from the deepest crevices of the heel cast. It was the creature's secretion, its digestive fluid, forcing its way out of the pores of the compressed earth. And then I heard it. A sound far quieter, far more intimate than the house cannon's devastating blast. A faint, chilling, secondary thump. A shallow, rapid pulse emerged not from the large structure 50 yards away, but directly from the preserved, fibrous cast of the child's sneaker. The ground was breathing beneath me, and it was using the shape of the little shoe print as a momentary, horrifying vent. My body was flat against the chest of the Macabre farm, and I realized with absolute crippling certainty that the creature didn't just consume the victims. It wore their final tragic imprint, and now that imprint was beginning to pulse with the vile, hungry rhythm of its host. I tried to push up, but my weight had settled perfectly into a shallow, wet depression in the soil, and the earth was beginning to stiffen around my boots, hardening them in place. The human footprint I was leaving behind was already setting. I tried to push up, the desperate need for verticality, battling the physical exhaustion and the high-frequency whine that still vibrated through the fused earth. My weight was fixed. I couldn't shift an inch. The shallow depression I had instinctively chosen for cover was now my burial shroud, tailor-made by the organism itself. The stiffening process was incredibly fast. It felt like trying to lift myself out of newly poured wet cement that had been mixed with coarse bone meal. My boots, heavy military issue, were perfectly anchored. I strained, muscles knotting, letting out a stifled, gasping grunt that was immediately swallowed by the expansive quiet of the Macabre farm. My jacket sleeves bunched painfully around my elbows as I dragged my body forward, leaving my lower half behind. The crust tore with a sickening, wet slurp sound beneath my chest, like peeling old, rotten leather from a floor. The pain on the back of my neck, where the pressurized shrapnel had grazed me, faded into a secondary concern, as a colder, chemical sensation took hold. The clear, viscous moisture seeping from the crust of the child's sneaker cast was now spreading rapidly, saturating the immediate area. It carried a searing acidity, a metallic tang of concentrated enzymes, making my eyes water violently. It wasn't just digestive fluid. It was a solvent, already dissolving the leather of my jacket and stinging the skin of my forearms pressed against the soil of 1942, Nebraska. The localized pulse, the shallow, rapid thump-thump-thump, was now directly beneath my left ear. It wasn't the strong, deep percussion of the hidden core 50 yards away. This was a quick, anxious fluttering, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of calcified remains. It was the creature's immediate, shallow breathing, venting pressure through the perfect, tiny outline of a lost child's shoe. The intimacy of that sound was paralyzing. I was literally lying against the pulsing, digestive chest of the killer. I had to move. Now. Before the corrosive fluid reached my face and before my own human footprint solidified around my entire lower body, cementing me permanently into the ground, I gave one final screaming heave, ignoring the tearing sensation in my spine. I didn't just pull my leg. I focused my entire remaining strength on the ankle, twisting and ripping it free from the soil. The sound was gruesome, a sound of suction and shearing, followed by a loud crack as the leather of the boot gave way. I tumbled forward half a rotation, catching myself on my hands, gasping for the dry, clean air that didn't exist on this property. My left boot was still partially trapped, wedged in the earth, but my right was free. I scrambled, desperately trying to find purchase on the slick, ghastly carpet of fused remains. As I dragged my body toward the nearest structure, a derelict woodshed that offered the thinnest hope of cover, I glanced back at the spot where I had been trapped. There, perfectly preserved, still glistening with the vile, clear secretion, was the mold of my own boot. The deep tread pattern, the slightly flattened heel, my human footprint, cast and set within seconds, resting right next to the horrific tiny mold of the child's sneaker. I had become one more grim exhibit in this gallery of the consumed. The main structure, the house that served as the primary feeder, had fallen momentarily quiet, the sweeping whine replaced by a heavy, grinding silence. But the internal, profound thump, thump of the main engine was now rising in intensity, faster than before. It wasn't rhythmic, it was an angry, investigative surge. And then, as I watched my own newly formed footprint, the calcified outline of the child's sneaker beside it shuddered. The rapid, anxious pulse beneath it ceased, replaced by a single, powerful thump. A deep, resonant contraction that sent a localized tremor through the fibrous crust. Where the heel of the child's sneaker impression met the edge of my own molded boot, the hardened crust began to bubble. It wasn't the slow seepage of fluid. This was a violent eruption. A section of the calcified soil, shaped perfectly like the curved arch of a foot, swelled outward, tearing the dense material. And from that tearing seam, a single, thick, black root, a feeder tendril glistening with the creature's digestive enzymes, shot out, not reaching, but seeking. It was moving at an unnerving speed, a sharp, probing appendage emerging directly from the ghastly memorial of the consumed, tracking the heat of my exposed ankle. I stared, horrified, realizing that the human footprints were not just molds, they were emergence points. The farm was reaching out to reclaim its newly processed material. The tendril paused just inches from my calf, vibrating slightly, tasting the air. Then the black root curled back abruptly, not retreating, but snapping taut and preparing for a lightning strike. Simultaneously, the monstrous house 50 yards away issued a deep, heavy chuff, like a massive lung expelling stale air, and the glowing orange light in the foundation conduits intensified to a blinding white. I had been located. The Macabre farm had not just found me, it was preparing to ingest me whole, and the very ground beneath me was actively assisting in the capture. I didn't wait for the preparatory snap. The moment the black root coiled, vibrating with liquid malice inches from my calf, I threw my weight sideways and backwards, utilizing the desperate, panicked thrust of an animal caught in a snare. My torn muscles screamed in unison with the tearing fibers in the soil still clinging to my left boot. The tendril struck where my ankle had been a half-second before. It wasn't a hiss or a crack. It was the sound of a pistol shot fired into heavy molasses, a dense, wet whump. Where the black appendage contacted the ground, the remaining outline of my boot impression instantaneously darkened, shriveling the edges of the mold. A plume of superheated steam, smelling sharply of sulfur and scorched leather, erupted, stinging my eyes. The root wasn't just a feeler. It was a pressurized, hyper-accelerated hypodermic needle, injecting solvent and setting agent simultaneously. If it had pierced my skin, I knew I wouldn't have had time for pain before my limb was chemically stabilized, a perfect, agonizing trophy. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, dragging my useless, trapped left leg. The derelict woodshed, a skeletal frame of gray, sun-bleached planks, was now only 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile across the treacherous, crust-covered earth of the Macabre farm. Every ragged breath I took rasped against the chemical residue clinging to the air, tasting like old pennies and furnace dust. The skin on my forearms, already exposed to the creeping solvent, now burned with a dull, pervasive ache, slicked with the oily runoff. I reached the threshold of the shed, collapsing inside the gloom. The interior floor was packed dirt, mercifully dry and free of the fibrous, calcified crust that carpeted the yard. I hauled my left leg, twisting viciously again, until the last fragment of the remaining sole leather ripped away, leaving the boot itself behind, a permanent artifact next to the child's sneaker. I was free, but my left foot was now only protected by a thick, tattered sock, vibrating from the exertion and the sheer proximity of death. The relief was instantaneous but brief. The woodshed was less shelter and more an incubator of stale decay. The air inside was thick and humid, heavy with the oppressive smell of decaying wood pulp, old hay, and something sickly sweet. The cloying metallic scent that always follows mass decomposition and subsequent chemical treatment. I scanned the interior rapidly, stacked moldering firewood, a rusted handsaw, and against the far wall, beneath a cobweb-draped burlap sack, the dark outline of what might be a rusted axe head. Outside, the farm was breathing again. The deafening surge that had turned the foundation conduit of the main house, a blinding white, had receded. But the light now glowed with the steady, incandescent pulse of a primed mechanism. The profound thump-thump of the hidden core was louder than ever, vibrating up through the packed earth beneath the shed floor. A rhythmic, guttural heart beneath the fields of 1942 Nebraska. It was waiting, listening for the panicked movement that would betray my location. I fumbled for the burlap sack, intending to retrieve the axe. My fingers, numb and clumsy, dragged the heavy cloth away, revealing not an axe, but a mound of rough, pulverized material, the bone meal. This was the source of the sickeningly sweet scent and the coarse texture I had felt when first sinking into the ground. It was stacked here, ready for application. But beneath the mound of bone meal embedded in the dirt floor of the shed was something far worse. It was a shoe, not a mold, but an actual artifact, half buried in the soil. A small brown leather brogue, scuffed and worn, sized for a boy of about 10. And near the toe of the brogue, perfectly centered, was a single small patch of the dense, fibrous crust, a perfect calcified circle, the diameter of a silver dollar. The patch was subtly convex, not flat, and from its center came a faint, wet, rasping sound. It wasn't the aggressive thump-thump of the yard prints. This sound was softer, continuous, like grinding teeth wrapped in cotton. Then the small circular crust began to shift. It was rotating slowly, grinding against the edges of the packed earth around it. As I stared, paralyzed by this new, sickening emergence, I realized what the sound was. It was not a feeder tendril being deployed. It was a pressure valve, a small secondary vent, grinding against the earth as it actively expelled air. And as the makeshift valve turned, creating a tiny pressurized aperture, a new smell exploded into the confines of the shed, pushing out the sweet decay. It was the scent of ozone and freshly cut metal, a chemical sting so potent it instantly burned the back of my throat. From the rotating vent, a shimmering, crystalline cloud of mist began to jet out, silently, rapidly filling the space around the boy's shoe. I lunged back, covering my mouth and nose, instinctively knowing that if the digestive liquid was caustic, this vaporized form, this internal breath, would be paralyzing. Through the stinging mist, I saw the discarded brogue shudder. The mound of bone meal beside it began to slide downward, drawn by an unseen gravitational pull. And as the fine, pulverized material settled, it revealed the true foundation of the woodshed. The entire supporting structure, the 4 corner posts driven into the ground, were not made of wood. They were coated in the thick, hardened layer of the same biological crust that covered the yard. The shed wasn't built on the ground. It was structurally integrated into the organism. And then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, emanating from the corner post closest to me. A low, rhythmic hiss, like pressurized steam escaping through a fault. I pressed my ear closer to the encrusted post, ignoring the burning sting of the air, and heard not just steam, but a mechanical, repetitive clicking. It wasn't a biological sound. It was the sound of a geared wheel turning slowly, methodically, deep within the calcified shell of the post. I realized with a sickening lurch of understanding that the human footprints leading into the ground were far less important than the structures built upon them. The woodshed was not a shelter. It was an access point, and it was processing something right now. My eyes dropped to the floor again, to the source of the ozone smell, and saw that the tiny rotating vent next to the child's shoe was now clicking, mimicking the sound in the post, and the crystalline mist wasn't stopping. It was saturating the enclosure, preparing the atmosphere. I knew that sound, that mechanical click, that hiss of air, that cold, stinging vapor. It wasn't digestion, it was sealing. I glanced wildly up, seeking an exit, and saw the single small window high on the back wall, but I was already losing coordination in the thick atmosphere. My eyes drifted down one last time to the rotating vent by the buried shoe. As I watched, the vent accelerated its turning, and instead of mist, a sudden blindingly sharp splinter of black silicate shot outward, pinning the leather tongue of the child's brogue deep into the soil. The venting was done, the processing chamber was sealed, and the methodical clicking inside the post suddenly changed tempo. It started moving faster, the sound growing into a harsh, vibrating whirr, signaling the moment the mechanism went from preparation to full operational speed. I was locked inside an active digestion chamber. The whirr was not merely a sound, it was a physical tearing of the air, an internal sonic wave that compressed the atmosphere of the small woodshed until the stinging chemical mist felt like liquid metal pressing against my lungs. My coordination vanished instantly. The shock of being locked inside this active digestion chamber paralyzed me, rooting me to the spot, even as the intense vibrations transmitted through the soles of my boots promised certain disintegration. I fought the vertigo, the paralyzing vapor searing my throat with the intensity of ozone and chlorine. Every muscle screamed against the forced stasis. My eyes, watering and stinging, snapped back to the nearest structural post, the source of that terrible mechanical scream. It was running at a speed designed not just to process material, but to tear the shed itself apart if necessary, securing its contents. I needed air or a weapon. Frantically, I clawed at the mound of pulverized bone meal beside me, hoping against hope to find the buried axe that had started this whole grotesque discovery. My fingers only found the soft, sickeningly sweet dust, mixed with fragments of material that felt less like fertilizer and more like calcified ceramic. It was the dust of what had gone before, the final product of the sickening consumption that stained the fields of this macabre farm. My hand brushed against a narrow, rusted object half hidden beneath a sagging shelf. Not the axe, but a heavy, blunt iron spike, a fence post marker, perhaps. It was cold, dense, and instantly real in the hypersensory environment. I gripped it, finding a fleeting surge of adrenaline that momentarily fought back the paralysis. With a ragged cry, I lunged toward the corner post, aiming the heavy spike at the point where the rhythmic hiss had been loudest, where I had sensed the slow turning of the hidden gear. I drove the spike, all my weight and panic behind it, into the thick, fibrous, encrusted coating. Clang! The metal shrieked against the shell, but the crust did not shatter. It was harder than concrete, reinforced by whatever nightmare material formed the organism beneath this 1942 Nebraska soil. Worse, the impact caused the post to retaliate. Where the spike struck, the surface instantly began to heat. A terrifying white-hot glow permeated the shell, focused precisely on the point of attack. The post was alive, not just sheltering the mechanism, but actively generating heat, threatening to weld my hand to the spike and the spike to the shell. I recoiled, dropping the marker with a cry of pain as the heat radiated outward, a searing pulse of rejection. The whir rose in pitch, momentarily overriding the core, thump, thump, vibrating up through the earth. The sound felt like pressure building, exponentially increasing the tension in the sealed space. I looked down, seeking escape, and saw the sickening evidence of the mechanism's function. The bone meal mound was not just vibrating, it was sinking rapidly, churning, pulled down by invisible forces into the packed earth floor. Around the perimeter of the small, sealed patch by the child's shoe, the soil cracked wider, and a thin, steaming slick of the caustic digestive fluid, dark amber and smelling of ammonia and rot, began to weep upward. The child's brogue, the key artifact revealing the true nature of the human footprints leading into the ground, was already starting to dissolve. its leather tongue softening and bubbling where the black silicate spike pierced it. This was the digestive tract's entryway, and I was about to be its primary course. Above me, the shed started to deform. The integrated corner posts, the thick, fibrous cylinders that weren't wood at all, began a slow, synchronized contraction. They pulled inward, distorting the simple square structure into a trapezoid. The small window I had marked as my only way out warped, its glass groaning under immense tightening strain. I was being sealed into a hermetic, pressurized crucible. The mechanical wire reached a critical threshold. Then, in an instant, it cut out entirely. The sudden silence was absolute, deafening in its relief, broken only by the frantic rasp of my own breathing and the soft crackling dissolution of the boy's shoe. My ears screamed with residual noise, but the paralysis started to recede slightly. I staggered back, using the reprieve to gain distance from the melting, steaming floor. "It's done," I thought wildly. The seal is complete, but the whir had stopped because the shed mechanism was now subservient to the core rhythm, the great pulsing heart of the farm, the guttural thump, thump. That had always been background noise, suddenly intensified, resonating directly through the floor beneath my feet. The entire earth beneath the woodshed gave a colossal shuddering heave. And then, just as I looked down, a long, heavy metal hinge, thick with rust and filth, swung violently outward from the center of the earthen floor, where the largest accumulation of bone meal had settled. It was a perfect, hinged square, roughly 4 feet across, and it didn't open with a gentle creak. It opened with the sound of ancient tearing leather peeling away from the soil, revealing a sudden yawning chasm beneath the shed floor. A chasm that glowed from below with the steady, blinding, incandescent white light of the organism's terrible, beating core. And rising from that terrifying, silent abyss was a staircase, a narrow, spiraling flight of steps formed entirely of polished, glistening, freshly cleaned bone. They were waiting for the next descent. The incandescent white light was not light at all. It was a hungry heat, sucking the oxygen from the air. The spiraling bone staircase, gleaming wetly, offered a terrifying, inescapable invitation. The Macabre farm's core rhythm, the guttural thump, thump, accelerated, vibrating through the contracting walls and deep into the soil of Nebraska. I knew my name, Arthur, but the identity felt transient, fading into the hot, bone meal dust. There was no escape. The shed walls pressed closer, metallic edges scraping my shoulders. The only remaining space was the mouth of the abyss. As I stumbled onto the first slick step, the heat rushed up to consume me, smelling terribly of rendered fat and ozone. I looked up. The heavy metal hinge slammed shut with an echoing final clang. I was submerged in darkness, save for the terrifying glow of the steps leading infinitely down. The last thing I heard was the internal thumping and the sickening sound of my own weight cracking the polished femur beneath my foot. For more tales of dread, see what terrors await you.